Hello, dear ones, and welcome to music lovers, poetry lovers, those who love to worship the Lord with music and song, and those who have an interest in music history and music theory. This first episode, I want to talk about what could be one of the greatest hymns ever. Could be the greatest. And it began originally as a Baroque ditty, As well as information about the wonderful people behind this hymn and its tune, this episode will contain a little bit of music theory for beginners, as well as a small amount of more advanced music theory and some music history. My name's Christopher Watson. I want to apologise for not being a more knowledgeable scholar or a more skilled musician or singer. Please forgive my many limitations. But I would nevertheless like to share with you my fascination that I've only had for the last few years, and my excitement for the spellbinding centuries of what we now call the classic hymns. I thought I knew what hymns were until my eyes were opened. First, let's listen to something. That was a piece of music called Tombstone that was used with an Isaac Watts hymn called When I Survey. It was first used with this. It was first paired with this hymn in a hymn book by John Wesley called Select Hymns with Tunes Annexed in 1761, and that's the first time that text and that music were published together, and indeed it was the first piece of music to be published together with that hymn, which is pretty amazing because the hymn itself was published as a hymn text in 1707. First, let me tell you a little bit about myself. In music terms, I spent most of my life playing a bit of jazz and blues and pop and rock, but I've been a long-time classical music listener. I was introduced to hymns, and it was a revelation for me when my wonderful mother, my late mother now, introduced me to a very fine musician at the local Presbyterian church in North Otago, and I started playing in their music group. It opened up a whole vast world to me. I had no idea previously what a huge, rich and complex genre the hymn genre is. It's a very beautiful one, and it's something I want to explore in what I hope will be a series of video podcasts. I want to talk about the music, the poetry, and include some music history and music theory because those are things that interest me. Hymns are a very interesting genre. They're beautiful little musical miniatures, really lovely in their smallness and perfectness. The smallness of a hymn is part of its artistry. It's a tasteful little setting for the little jewel inside, the hymn text. The hymn tune is intended as a spiritual receptacle for the poetic text. And hymns are the true people's music in Western history because they're intended to be playable and singable by amateurs. In the case of hymns, the audience are also the performers because the congregation sings them. So the congregation are participating simultaneously in a spiritual and creative artistic event. I want to talk about pairing, this idea of pairing a text with a tune. I used to think, before I really understood hymns, I thought hymns were like a song, sort of a genre of song, where, the music and the words were written together and belonged together. But this is not usually how hymns work. Traditionally in Western music, of course, the text comes before the music. It's conventional, not in the modern world, but in Western musical history. It was the conventional way for the librettist or the lyricist to write the words and the composer to set music to those words. It's a little bit like that with hymns, but the texts are actually quite separate from the music, often, not always. Texts are written as poems, and the music may be written to suit a text, so the composer may intend that music to be for that text, but very often the music is written separately from the text, or music that was used for another text can be applied to this text. And this can all be done by the publishers, the ministers, music leaders, members of the congregation even. So this idea of pairing is very loose and free in the hymn genre. When I Survey, for example, was written in 1707 and was presumably played to tunes that suited its metre. It was paired with the tombstone text, as I said, in the 1760s, and was not paired regularly with the tune we're going to cover today, called Rockingham, until the 19th century. This is an important point, and it will come up again. It's a unique artistic method. Authors publish texts, composers publish music, performers, hymn book editors, congregations select combinations of text and music. The metrical index in your hymn book is a guide to this. This is a collaborative and democratic process. Sometimes the text and tune become strongly associated, but often that takes place or took place generations after each one was written. As a general rule, a hymn text doesn't have a title. In hymn books or in the excellent hymn book database, hymnary.org, which I use a lot, texts are identified by their first line. For example, in a Methodist hymn book from 1882 called Tribute of Praise, published in Pittsburgh and Baltimore, which I found on hymnary.org again, let's look at just a few pages. So here's the title page. And here's the index of tunes, which is alphabetical, so the names of the tunes, an index of first lines with the authors. Then you get an interesting thing, the metrical index. The numbers are syllables. So for example, 8888 means 4 lines of 8 syllables. You'll often see the abbreviation CM, which is common meter, which is 8686, one of the most popular early metrical patterns. So 8 syllables, 6 syllables, 8 syllables, 6 syllables. And sometimes, for example, with this tune, it might be written as LM, which is long meter, 8888. 8 syllables, 8 syllables, 8 syllables, 8 syllables. Another one you'll see is DM, or double meter. So that's 2 sets of 8686. So that's 8 lines going 86, 86, 86, 86. And then you get all sorts of other meters. Another really important point is that hymns are not performed to a passive audience. The congregation sings them. The real audience, of course, is God. But the human audience are also participants. Hymns are intended as a genre to be enjoyed and performed as they are enjoyed by amateurs. One such pair, a text and tune that have become strongly associated, Isaac Watts' text, As I Survey the Wondrous Cross, and the tune with which it has become commonly associated, Rockingham. So now we'll hear the text as a poem and have a quick look at it. We'll listen to the music. We'll talk about how an older tune was adapted to create Rockingham, and we'll look at how beautifully that was done. And we'll look at a little bit about how music reading works for those who are learning to read music, and we'll have some music theory and music history. And then I'll sing it for you. There are a whole range of writers and composers of hymns and tunes. Some of them are famous, very famous composers sometimes. But many of the most beautiful were written and composed by people who were and still are relatively unknown. This one's by a very famous man, Isaac Watts, who's sometimes called the father of English hymnody. He's called this not because he was the first, he wasn't, but because he was a great poet with a large corpus of excellent work, and he set in motion a long period of poetic and musical creativity. So here's the poem. This here is the first published version, and this is the one most people will be familiar with. There's really only one major difference, which is this line here. I'm going to read the first published version because it's always nice to hear the first version that a poet wrote. When I survey the wondrous cross where the young Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my Lord. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to his blood. See from his hands, his head, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did e'er such love and sorrow meet, or thorns compose so rich a crown? His dying crimson like a robe spreads o'er his body on the tree. Then I am dead to all the globe, and all the globe is dead to me. Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were a present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. In this text he has a quote from Galatians at the top, Galatians 6:14, and this poem is a personal response by Isaac Watts to this passage of St. Paul's writing. Galatians 6 is a really challenging passage. For example, this line here where it says, all the vain things that charm me most. He's not talking about wicked worldly things. He's talking about spiritual things. He's talking about being a member of a church and trying to be a good man and a good Christian and so on. And the pride here, he's not talking about worldly pride. He's talking about Christian pride and being a good Christian and doing things properly. Because St. Paul in this passage is talking about how those things are meaningless unless you have a really true relationship with Christ and with God. It's an interesting philosophical passage. I'm not going to go into it too much because I'm not knowledgeable enough to give analysis of Scripture. Let's just look at the text as a piece of poetry because that's something I understand. So this is interesting. This line here, if you're familiar with this hymn, slightly different. The version we all know, when I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died. And here in the first published version, it was when I survey the wondrous cross where the young Prince of Glory died, which is interesting, the idea of emphasizing Jesus' youth, which for me as an old man, he was a young man, Jesus. you know, for the early 1700s, it's beautiful natural language. If you've read the poetry of this time, it's often very elaborate, very constructed. But there are one or two bits of vocabulary that are not completely familiar to us. We use the word survey slightly differently, you know, to look upon, to survey. But basically this is it's nice poetry. It's got a lovely rhythm and a lovely sound, and it's authentic. It's got genuine and personal emotion in it. It's not elaborate, you know, it's a plain, direct language that people can understand. I like it a lot. I particularly like this stanza here. Did e'er such love and sorrow meet, e'er meaning ever, if you're not familiar with old-fashioned English, or thorns compose so rich a crown. You'll notice he uses the long S, these things that look like Fs, slightly unfinished Fs, are S's. This verse here, or this stanza here, here it's bracketed. You see, he wanted to remove it, but he was talked out of it. And sometimes you don't find that verse in the hymn book. It's a little bit dark. His dying crimson, well, there's the blood. But I think this part here, I am dead to all the globe and all the globe is dead to me. I think maybe Isaac Watts found that a little bit dark and he had second thoughts, but I like it, you know, it's authentic. It's a beautiful poem and a beautiful hymn. So the tune we're talking about today primarily is a tune called Rockingham, for which Edward Miller is called the arranger, or the harmonizer, in fact. I think he did more than harmonise it. It's a very, very beautiful adaptation of an earlier tune. For Rockingham, what Edward Miller did was to take an earlier piece, a piece of popular music from the Baroque. I need to explain something about the Baroque. The Renaissance and the Baroque in music are not really distinct. You get this long period of musical innovation that begins very early in what we think of as the Renaissance and continues through the Baroque. And it's very hard to say, here's a clear cut-off line between the Renaissance and the Baroque. And in fact, the Baroque itself has all these sort of subsections, but it all flows. It's an amazing period full of innovation and development, and all sorts of new ideas are coming along, and new compositional techniques and new instruments. It's a beautiful, beautiful period, one of my favourites. But one of the things that happened in the Baroque, and it began in the Renaissance, but it really became a big thing in the Baroque, were chords. So harmony was always understood. Harmony was understood in medieval time, the way that notes fitted together. But the concept of a chord as this little brick that you could put together with other bricks to create a structure was something that really belongs to the early Baroque. In fact, it took a long time for chords in the Baroque to be given the names that we know today. They were using them, but actually the names came surprisingly late. So this idea of chords, you know, using chords in a very structural fashion within generally one key is a very Baroque thing. So Edward Miller has taken this piece of Baroque music and he's transformed it in a very beautiful and very subtle way to make it into a piece of classical music. Classical music has this added dimension, which is movement between tonal areas. So you have keys and you can move away from a key, you can move into an entirely different key. And for a very long piece like a symphony, that's what they did. They moved from one key to another key, then back to the original key, which is why the parts of a symphony are called movements. And this idea of movement, this idea of tonal movement, so moving from one key to another, requires preparation. And this is something that, in a small way, because it's a hymn, it's a miniature piece of music, but in a small way, Miller does this, and he creates a very charming piece of classical music, very unobtrusively, from an earlier Baroque tune. Who was Edward Miller? Well, Edward Miller, he was famous in his day. He played the flute in the Handel's orchestra. This was later Handel. Edward Miller's a lot younger than Handel, so he didn't play on the water music, for example. He was a music publisher. He published a lot of music from Europe. He published a very good book for learning music, which is called The Institutes of Music. We might think of that a little bit like the fundamentals of music. And it's for how to play, well, it's how to play the keyboard, because there were so many different types of keyboards in those days, not just the harpsichord or the forte piano. It's got scales in it and then tunes that increase in difficulty. It's quite a good book. You can download it. And if you want to know more about this tune and how it developed, there's an excellent article on a website called Hymnology Archive, who have wonderful articles on a number of different hymns, a great many in fact, and I'll be referring to them again in the future. So Edward Miller was a publisher, he was a musician, presumably a performer, and he he edited and compiled a very good hymn book that was very popular in its day, generally called the Psalms of David. It had a slightly longer name, in 1790, and that's where the tune Rockingham first appeared. So let's hear these two tunes. Let's start with Tunbridge. So this is a Baroque tune. It was the tune to a song called Dives and Lazarus that was popular at the time. If you know the tune Rockingham, it sounds very similar, doesn't it? But there are some important differences, and we'll look at that in a minute. Edward Miller is sometimes called a harmonizer, but he really adapted the tune, and he did it with very light touch and great artistry and real love. He refined what was actually a very charming tune. Tunbridge is a pretty tune, into one of the most loved hymn tunes, and he did it very carefully and subtly without altering it too much, and yet the transformation is huge in terms of the final effect. So now let's hear Miller's Rockingham. So let's look at Edward Miller's original score. Publishing was not cheap. Music publishing was not cheap in these days. And music typesetting existed, but this one has been engraved. So it's not a very perfect copy of it. I took the background out and I lost some of the detail. But it's been lovely. It's a lovely engraving. It looks like handwriting. It's intended to be played very slowly, It's not 3/4, it's 3/2. So, and largo, slow. Well, largo means large, but it means slow. Largo con affetto. So with affectation, with an expression of emotion. It's an E flat. 3 flats is E flat. I've converted my one to, I've transposed my one to D because it's easier to play and sing. It's got figured bass. That was sort of a way of writing chords. I like to write chords on my scores. They make it easier for me to play, and it's also a type of analysis. We'll look at figured bass a little bit later. It's a very, very interesting way of representing chords, and it's got sort of a they had a slightly different way of looking at some of the chords, which is you might find interesting too. He's actually taken the figured bass and he's marked out one way of playing it, but figured bass was considered something you would work out for yourself. You'd put your own style into it. Now, for those who are not familiar with sheet music, let's just quickly look a little bit at sheet music. So this is D. This one here, 3 flats, that's E flat. I transposed it down just a little. It's easier to play and easier to sing. To D. 2 sharps is the key of D. So the lines and spaces on a score represent do, re, mi. They're not semitones, they're not chords, they're not frets. Sheet music is all based on scales. So you're in the key, and then, for example, here in the key of D, low D would be down here. Then there's a D here, a D here, which you could also write here. There's a D here. Now, by the time you get to the bottom of the bass clef is very low. For example, the lowest note on a guitar is E, and the highest note that's easy to play on a guitar, this is high E here. So it covers a very big span, sheet music. That's the intention, is to keep it within the stave. If you go beyond the stave, they're called ledger lines, or from a man called Leger, but in English we say ledger. You can go all the way to a very high D here, but that's impossibly high. That would not a typical human voice could not get that high. And then within that, you'll see, this one's on the space, on the line, on the space, on the line. Reading music takes a little bit of practice. It's not that difficult. You just sort of, you find your starting point and you follow the notes up and down. And once you get used to it, I mean, if the music itself is difficult, then reading music is difficult. But it's not really that hard to play the kinds of things you'll find in church, for example, to play or sing them. If, for example, you play a bass instrument, in Western music, all basses are double basses, because every instrument that's called a bass plays an octave lower than the bass clef. Sometimes you'll get ledger lines between these are staves. This is called the grand stave. And between the treble and the bass, you'll get ledger lines. In fact, there's only one note lying between the lines. There's middle C. So you go here, A, B, C, D, E. But sometimes you will see something like this. You'll see an A, written like that, which could have been written here. Could be written there. The reason for that is the convention with the grand stave, you know, the treble clef and bass clef together, is that the bass clef is the left hand on the piano, the treble clef is the right hand on the piano. Or in singing, the bass clef is the men, the bass clef is the basses and the tenors, and the treble clef is the altos and the sopranos. So it's a nice way of seeing everything in a nice, neat, concise little piece of notation. So when you're learning music, you know, you learn your scales, you learn your do, re, mi, and one of the other things to learn is to recognize intervals. So the sweet sounding intervals are designed to look neat on the page. So for example, there's a third, here's a fifth, you know, they look very neat. An octave looks like that. And you just sort of learn to recognize them. Okay, let's look at it phrase by phrase. This is the first phrase of Tunbridge and the first phrase of Rockingham. And they look quite similar. I've put chords into it. I like to put chords into tunes. It's easier for me. I'm used to it. A lot of the same chords. The one thing to note though is that Miller creates these very specific melodic phrases in classical music. And when I mean classical music, I'm talking about the sort of short classical. So, you know, you have the Renaissance and Baroque, a very long period. Then from the mid to late 1700s to the sort of early 1800s, that's the real classical period. Then there's the Romantic period. It's quite a short period, but a lot of really good ideas came out of this period. And one of the writing techniques they had was this idea of motifs, or they call them motives, where you have small melodic themes that you can then make variations on. This is only a short piece, so he's not doing variations within it, but he has turned it into this nice classically phrased piece of music. The original is very lovely too. I'm not criticizing the original, but if you look here, so then we've got this, and then, so he's got kind of this one little motif, and then he has this kind of thing here. Bum, 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 bum. As a sort of a little motif that he uses. Let's have a listen to it. And this here is worth noting too, this little flourish. Miller doesn't use it. He doesn't use it here, but he uses it later on. Here's the second phrase, and you can see here this is the kind of thing you'd have in folk music, where the writer, whoever wrote this, is within the key, and they're kind of exploring the colours of the different chords. You've got the B minor and the F sharp minor and so on. Whereas Miller does something much more classical. He isn't really exploring the chordal colours of the key, but he's playing with the tonal centre. So you know, this little major 7 just pulls it a little bit away from the key, and the resolution here with the D over A, he's kind of moving it towards the tonal center of A. Have a listen to it. So you can hear how he's pulling it a little bit away from D and then moving it towards A. Now the third set of phrases is where it really changes. So again, the writer of Tunbridge is, there's two things here. The writer of Tunbridge is doing the same thing as before. He's using the sort of chordal colours, and he's this phrase goes from A to A, so he's not just staying statically in one key, obviously, when this sophisticated music. There's two interesting things. First of all, there's a leap down, followed by 2 downward steps. And actually this would be hard to sing. It's a little bit hard to play. Miller is very much pushing it into the key of A. He's sort of saying, now for this phrase we're in A. So he starts in A, then he moves nice and strongly to E. So E is the 5th of A. A is we started in D. A is the 5th of D, so they call that the dominant, and A resolves to D. And then E is the 5th of A, and E resolves to A. So he's sort of pushing it into this key area by using E to resolve to A. And you can hear it. And he does it again here. There's this E moving into A, so that when we get to the final A in the phrase, it really feels settled onto A. And in terms of the leap, so he leaps down and then he changes direction. And this is recommended in voice writing. It's easier for singers. A leap is a little bit hard for a singer. So when you leap up, you should move back down. And if you go down, if you leap down, you know, leap being a larger interval than, really just a larger interval than a step, but you know, quite a large leap, a sixth. So you leap down and then you change direction. Is easier to sing. And that's a much smoother passage. And again, he's got that same motif, the crotchet, minim, crotchet, minim, little motif going there, which is cute. And then for the last sequence, these are again a little bit similar, but he takes the flourish. Here's the flourish. The first phrase, slightly different, but pretty similar. He takes that flourish and puts it at the end where it can sort of do something. It can serve a melodic purpose to bring it to the end. It's a charming piece. It's really a charming piece. The original piece is lovely, and the adaptation is done with a really gentle touch. They call him a harmonizer in the hymn book, but I think that's a little unfair. He's a lot more than a harmonizer. He's done a beautiful, beautiful adaptation and made this one of the most popular hymn tunes of all time. Really lovely work. See from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did as such love and sorrow beach, thorns compose so rich a crown. Thorns compose so rich a crown. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour content on all my pride. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my Lord. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to his blood. Were the whole realm of nature mine, it were a present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. That's a beautiful hymn. Praise be to God.